We are creatures of desire. What we most desire is meaning. What makes us suffer most is a lack of meaning.
The Meaningful Life with Andrew G. Marshall. Marital therapist, author, and communications trainer Andrew G. Marshall invites guests from all walks of life to discuss what makes life meaningful.
Hello, I'm Andrew G. Marshall. Welcome to The Meaningful Life. We're available on Apple, Spotify, Podbean, and wherever you find your podcasts. Sometimes I do an exercise with my clients where they have to stand and look into a full-length mirror, and as part of a self-forgiveness ritual, say the words, "I love you." When we reflect on the exercise afterwards, they're often unsettled. Most have never said, "I love you" to themselves. There is something about self-love which feels transgressive or perhaps just wrong. However, according to my witness today, if you don't love yourself, what you do for your neighbours might not be so good. Dr. Bud Harris is a father, a husband, a grandfather, and a Zurich-trained Jungian analyst. He's also the author of a book called Sacred Selfishness, a guide to creating a life of love, authenticity, and substance, and lives in North Carolina, USA. This is the book that you wished you could have read in your early 30s, when you were a successful businessman providing the best possible opportunities for your family and your children, but your personal life was in a cul-de-sac. Tell me more.
That's true. My personal life was in a cul-de-sac because I had fulfilled the narrative of success for our culture, which was at that time, to have a family. I was married. I had 3 children. I had a successful business career. And with a partner, we owned our own business, which was doing well. And 2 things happened. To begin with, I began to feel like I've gotten everything. Why am I not happy here? What is missing in my life? At the same time, that became a more acute question because my wife came down with a very serious chronic illness, which left me with other responsibilities. And I realized that I had been living a life that was basically not one that I had defined, one that the culture had defined. And I didn't know what to do next. And I tried doing several things. I tried my own business was the first thing I tried. Of course, because of my wife's illness, we went to psychotherapy, and that put me on a new path of how to look at life in a different way. And that began to change. And eventually, in the difficulties of that period, I began to read Carl Jung. And reading Jung spoke to me deeply. There were times when I was reading it in tears, but I knew that it was touching the very depths in me, but I didn't really understand it, and I didn't know what to do. And years later, once I became an analyst, I decided to write this book, and this book is a matter of heart for me. And I wrote it to be the book I wish someone had written for me to read, introducing me to Jungian psychology, not in a shallow way, but in an intense way, but in a way that I could understand, that I could have read back when I was 35 years old.
And so why do you think you had actually hit this cul-de-sac?
I think I hit the cul-de-sac because the narrative of success in our culture was not a personal narrative. It didn't fulfill who I really was. It didn't touch the parts of me that needed to be developed. It gave me what looked like a good life, but it did not give me an authentic life or a meaningful life or a life that was helping me grow in terms of love and satisfaction.
So you talk about there being 2 kinds of selfishness. What are they?
Originally, I read Nietzsche, and that he used the term sickly selfishness. And that's the kind of selfishness that's egotistic, that's power-oriented, that's self-gratifying. Sacred selfishness is the opposite of that. That's where we really try to become people who are with depth, with character, with breadth, where we try to become people who understand what their own capacities for growth are. And we pursue that through the pursuit of consciousness, through the pursuit of self-knowledge. And giving ourselves that kind of attention is what I call sacred selfishness.
So how can we be sure we're coming from sacred selfishness rather than from ego?
There are two ways to be sure of that. The first is that we know that if we're coming from ego, it's about self aggrandizement. And if we're coming from sacred selfishness, we're developing ourselves so that our inner glass, so to speak, of spirit and love gets filled and begins to overflow into the world. If it's to gain attention, if it's to gain success in a direct way, then it has a tendency to be more ego.
But
And I'm
often,
not against ego development. Ego needs to be strong. We need to develop our ego, but we don't need to be egoistic.
can you explain to me what you mean by ego development?
Well, we start out in childhood and we have to learn how to cope with the world, how to develop ourselves. We have to learn how to grow into adulthood. We have to have an ego, that is, an identity and a persona that's strong enough for us to be able to live in the world of work and relationships. And that becomes the foundation then for additional psychological and spiritual growth.
So there's nothing wrong with having an ego. We actually need an ego.
We need an ego and we need a good ego. And usually when we're egoistic or have sickly selfishness, it's because we have a weak ego and we feel afraid.
So we've got two tasks. We've actually got to make certain our ego is strong enough to be a foundation, and then we have to
Yes,
build sacred selfishness on top of that. Am I hearing that correctly?
that's correct. Yes.
So how do you help somebody get a sort of, for want of a better word, a good enough ego, so it's not one that's dependent on getting, pleasing other people, for example?
There are two steps in that. One, we have to do what we call in Jungian psychology, first half of life work. We have to help the person work through whatever shaped and formed them as they were growing up. So people have different traumas, different wounds, different experiences. The culture trains us in ways to fit the culture. And we have to go through the story of our growth and sort out what needs to be faced, what needs to be healed, and what needs to free us to become more authentically who we're meant to be. And in that authenticity, then we develop an ego and a persona that relates us to the world in a way that's more real, that's more expressive of who we are.
So let's take that first part. Perhaps if you can give an example of yourself, what you actually did, that might help us understand. Because my understanding from reading your book is that actually you became a businessman because that's what your father wanted you to be. So that's possibly the opposite of having a strong ego.
Yes, and I had a certain amount of trauma in my childhood. My mother died when I was 14, and our family went through some tough periods. And that left me caught in a certain sense of confusion and depression. And so I followed what my father thought, what the culture recommended in terms of growing up without really having any idea of who I really wanted to be or what my potential was. And at the time I grew up, there was a pretty strong narrative in the culture of what a successful life is. And it was, grow up, have a good job, have a family, have a nice home, those sorts of things.
So we're talking about the 50s, are we?
We are, yes. And then when we got into the 60s, that narrative began to crumble.
And how did that impact on you?
It left me with a state of confusion. But by that time, I was already looking into my own path and how to change my life and how to go in different directions.
So we look at the story from the first half of our life and we ask ourselves, what sort of questions?
What were the main benefits that shaped us? What are the main emotions that shaped us? What are the main emotions that we're denying? Because we live in a culture that essentially teaches us to deny the strength of our emotions, whether they're good or bad. We deny the strength of our anger, the strength of our suffering, but also the strength of our joy, because if you deny suffering, you also deny joy. They're two sides of the same coin in terms of what we experience. And our culture teaches us to do things that perpetuate the consumer-driven culture, which is the culture we live in America. And to begin to free ourselves from that, we have to have an event or something that wakes us up, or we have to wake up or become dissatisfied with the way that we're living.
And it sounds like your waking up was a very slow process. You didn't actually hit the wall. It's sort of the air just slowly went out of the tires. Am I hearing that correctly?
You are hearing that correctly. And a slow process in that it was a process that took over probably 3 or 4 years to get started good, and then 10 years to round out.
I have to say, I think a lot of my listeners are going to feel a little bit depressed when they hear that it takes that amount of time. Should they be depressed?
No, they
Or
shouldn't be depressed, because we have to understand that life is always calling on us to awaken more. It's always calling us to grow. It's always calling us to become a better self. And once we get into that process, yes, there's struggles in it, but there's also joy, there's excitement in it, and there's a capacity to become more whole, to become more loving, to really experience life in a much different way. And to me, it's been the most rewarding way to live. And the people that I know that end up living this way end up with a future that they never could have imagined. It's beyond what we could have imagined.
and I think the thing to say is that it's not 10 years of misery. It gets slowly better across those 10 years.
Oh, and not only did it get slowly better, but there's excitement in that time. There's new discovery in that time, new discovery in the world, new discovery in yourself. And it makes life interesting. And we begin to realize that life is something that we need to face in its totality. We need to face the blood, sweat, tears, and laughter as well, because laughter has mixed into all of that.
And in a sense, you can't get the laughter without actually facing the blood and the tears. We can't actually choose, oh, I have the laughter, but not the blood and the tears. You have to have them all.
You have to have them all. You have to have the whole experience of life if you're going to, yeah, you can have happiness without blood, sweat, and tears, maybe, or a shallow kind of happiness, but you can't have joy, and you can't have what I call true laughter.
So a quote from your book: we think we know ourselves, but we do not. What's stopping us from knowing ourselves?
Two things I think stop us. One is that it takes effort, it takes commitment, and we have to know that it's something that will benefit us. The other thing is that we live in a culture now that doesn't promote that kind of depth, that kind of thinking. Our religious institutions don't promote it. Our educational institutions don't promote it. Everything is geared toward, at least in the American culture, primarily toward consumerism and economics and political power. There's been a frightening survey that came out from millennials 10 or 15 years ago, when they were asked what they wanted in their life. And the two things that were most wanted were fame and wealth. And to me, that was a scary statistic.
Yes. I mean, good luck to them is all I can say.
Yes. But we're not going to create a community. We're not going to create a culture. We're not going to create spiritual value or personal depth in those pursuits.
So the first task for sacred selfishness is to create a strong enough ego to build sacred selfishness on. So give us a sense of how we build sacred selfishness.
Well, once we have built a strong enough ego, what we need to do to build sacred selfishness is to become fully engaged in life, take the time to reflect on the experiences that brings us, listen to life, listen to our bodies, listen to our unconscious through dreams, do some journaling, do creative work that inspires us. And from that, change our life in the ways that unfold from that, and also begin to focus on creating a loving heart.
How do you create a loving heart?
I think as you go into this process and you pay attention and you reflect and you engage, you begin to sense that there's meaning in life. You begin to sense that there's meaning in your experiences. And you begin to see life as broader than what you imagined it to be. And Jung, in the very end of his autobiography, Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, talks about the power of love. And the more we go on this journey, the more that we learn to love life, the more that we learn that loving life depends on loving ourselves in a good way, not in a selfish way. And we need to branch out, because we will automatically begin to overflow and influence people around us. And it's a very enriching way to live.
So do you think if we knew ourselves better, we would like ourselves better, or would we just be horrified?
I think people are afraid of getting to know themselves better because they're afraid they'll be horrified. But actually, the opposite is true because we begin to find out that there's a lot about ourselves to like, and a lot of what we don't like is paradoxical. I'll give you an example of that. We talk a lot about shadow in Jungian psychology, and a lot of people are afraid of facing their shadow. They think that's the dark, evil part. And I give an example in the book. I think of a dream that I had at one point where I had gangsters in the dream, and I was really upset by that. And I began to journal about the gangsters. I began to look at them in a different way. And I began to dialogue with them in what we call active imagination. So it's like writing a play with myself and the gangsters having a conversation. And I discovered that they were actually the aggression that I had repressed in myself that I needed in my own defense in many personal situations and many business situations. I was too much of a nice guy. And when I repressed my need to stand up for myself, then it appeared in my unconscious in a negative way, but it was really offering me an opportunity to grow and expand myself.
So a lot of these things that we dispossess, like in your case, your aggression, goes into our shadow
Yes.
and is lost to us consciously. It's still there unconsciously, and it could pop up when we're stressed or something like that, but we can't actually access it and use it in a constructive kind of way. Am I hearing that correctly?
You're hearing that correctly. And it's as we grow and we form an identity, we repress parts of ourselves to fit into our environment, our families, our schools. We repress things to get approval. And those are the things that could have been part of our identity but got repressed. And that's what our shadow is made up of.
So losing your mother at 14, were the things that you repressed that went into your shadow that you actually probably needed?
Yes, quite a few things because it really hindered my development. And it left me in a place of, being 14 to 15 with a family. I never lived at home again after that. So I went into what was probably a 10-year depression. And I continued to accomplish certain things doing that. I finished school, I went to college, I got married, but the vitality that I had and the potentials that I could have developed were not there.
Why did you not live at home anymore?
My father remarried. I had a brother and a sister, and there were two other children that my stepmother had. And because of the age that I was at, that I went to a private school and then went to college.
My gosh, I can feel the pain that must have been trapped inside your heart, I think is the word I want to say at that point.
Yes. And it stayed trapped there. It was in analysis that I really got in touch with that. And that was in my late 30s.
And how can you love if you've got all of this pain trapped in your heart?
You can only love to a limited extent. I would say that I loved my wife and I loved my children, and I loved them in a conventional way. And I did my conventional duties. And it was only when I really began therapy in my early 30s that I began to understand what love really meant, even with my wife and children.
And how did you address that to them?
Over a period of time, as I realized that, I expressed it more and I lived with it more and I found more enjoyment with them. And of course, then with my wife's illness, things got very tough because of that.
So I think what a lot of people find is that they've got a family that they're responsible for. They've got children that have needs and they have a partner who needs their support. How do you balance self-love and doing the things that you need to do for your own, let's put it as sanity, and providing and supporting those other people? How do you actually balance those two things, loving yourself and loving your family?
There are two parts of that as well. There's the part that is very difficult to balance. And it's something that takes commitment on both sides. And so I'm committed to two different directions. And I have to live in the tension between those two directions. But the second thing is the more that I develop myself, the more that I love myself, the more I have to give to them, and the deeper my relationships with them came. So there is a tension, but there is also a reward.
Now you're going to have to explain to me how I'm going to live in the tension.
Well, there is the tension. I have my responsibilities to take care of my children, to take care of my family, to spend a certain amount of time with them, to earn a certain amount of living. And then I need to spend a certain amount of time with myself, reflecting on my life, reflecting on my experiences, reading and studying. And in my own case, I went back to graduate school for a number of years. So that took quite a commitment. And so there was always a tension between what I was doing to develop myself, what I was doing with my family and my loved ones and my obligations. And yet, the very fact that I had that tension showed that I also loved both paths. I loved them and I loved what I was doing for myself.
There's an image that we get from airplanes that they always say you have to put on your own mask when the oxygen masks come down before you help other people.
Correct.
Because obviously, if you don't, you're going to die. That lesson that we have to actually put on our own mask first before we can help other people, I think that applies as much to love as well, doesn't it?
Yes, it does, sure. That applies to the way that I dealt with my children.
But, I mean, it feels terribly selfish to look after ourselves first. Why do we feel so culturally uncomfortable about putting on our own mask first?
I think there are a number of reasons for that. None to begin with, and we've had a religion that has taught us basically, whether we're part of it or not, it permeates our culture and it teaches us to deny ourselves, which is an inaccurate interpretation of it from my standpoint. We also have a culture that wants to sustain itself. Our culture wants to grow, and it wants to grow economically, and we have to work more and spend more and do a lot of things that make our definition depend on what we're achieving and what we're accomplishing and what we're accumulating outside rather than inside.
So how do we learn to love ourselves?
It's not an easy thing to do. And you mentioned that in the introduction, because we live in a world that teaches us to deny ourselves, to become alienated from ourselves. And so we have to go countercultural to begin with. And we have to understand that loving ourselves is not a matter of buying more and more material things or taking better vacations or better trips or better baths or any of that kind of stuff. It's developing the interior potentials that we have for love and for joy, and also for participating fully in life. And that's no easy task. And when I first heard that, and this was popular back in the 60s, people were saying, love your neighbor as yourself means you have to love yourself first. And I thought, well, okay, how do you do that? I don't know how to do that. And I took the teachings of Carl Rogers, the great humanistic psychologist. And he said, in a therapeutic relationship, you have to give people unconditional positive regard. You have to be genuine and empathetic with them. And so I said, okay, I'm going to do that with myself. That's where I'm going to start. I'm going to try to be genuine. I'm going to try to be empathetic. I'm going to try to be warm. And I'm going to try to give myself not unconditional acceptance, but unconditional positive regard.
And when I have clients and I suggest that to them, that actually, if they're going to need to become more empathetic, normally it's men who are being told by their wives they need to become more empathetic, that they need to become more empathetic with themselves first, because if you're not empathetic with yourself, how can you possibly be truly empathetic to somebody else? I mean, that is a shock to them.
Yes. A lot of people have responded to me, particularly men, that I thought you're not supposed to be needy. And actually, it's not being needy. It's needing to have people that care about each other. And we need to care about each other. And we need to understand that that's one of the main things that enriches human life is our capacity to care about each other.
And you can't care about somebody else until you truly care about yourself.
That's right. And, to be honest with you, you can't treat other people with respect and courtesy if you don't treat yourself that way.
Very wise. Now, something you talk about a lot in your book is something that Jung writes about, which is individuation. So
That's right.
What is that and how does it fit in with self-love?
the two go hand in hand. Jung talks about the individuation process as our process of developing consciousness, relating to our whole selves, which means body, mind, and spirit, but also relating to our unconscious and our dreams and listening to that, listening to life. And it's the process of growth that we are motivated to go through for our entire life, right up to the end of our life. And that generates self-love, but it also requires a certain amount of self-love.
And you talk about individuation being a sort of like the story or the plot of your life.
Individuation puts me in touch with the plot of my life or the design of my life or the pattern that my greater self has from my own unique potential development. And each one of us has a pattern like that within us. Very few of us become aware of that. But it really is what leads to our becoming an individual in the true sense. And by saying an individual, I don't mean individualistic, but I mean separate from the forces that molded us, separate from the forces of the society.
So can you give an example from the book of an individuation story so we can understand what you mean?
I think my own story is a story of individuation. And I think the wall that I hit after doing everything that the cultural narrative said I should do and found that not satisfying. And fortunately, I found it not satisfying early, not later. And then began the struggle and the path of changing my life in a continuous basis, seeking self-knowledge, seeking professional knowledge as well. And I think it's very important to develop the mind and the heart together. I don't think that we need to just develop one or the other. They need to develop together. So we need to read, we need to study, we need to pay attention, we need to listen to life, as well as listening to our own emotions and help them grow. And to be open to where that pattern in your life is going to take you. Don't fix it into a fixed pattern. Let it evolve. So in my mind, is the first half of life is goal-directed. The second half of life needs to be a life of discovery of self, discovery of outer life, discovery of new opportunities, maybe even new careers, new ventures.
And with discovery, do you have to know where you're going, or do you just sort of follow the first sort of curious thought?
I don't follow the first curious thought. I do try to know where I'm going initially, because that gives a little bit of security. I often find out that that's not really where I'm going, though, but I pursue it anyway. And then I become more and more open to it. And, in the second half of life, I've become much more open to what life is bringing me. And then how do I need to respond to that creatively or lovingly or with commitment?
So give me an example of something that life has brought to you that you've responded to with curiosity and love.
Well, there's a lot of things. To start with, I went back to school with 3 children and went out of business, changed careers, got my doctor's degree in psychology. I had a successful psychological practice. Then I felt like I had a call to go to Zurich to become an analyst. That was a major change. So I went 5.5 years to Zurich to study, came back, started in analytic practice. From that, I went on to lecture and to write. So it's been a constant evolution.
And what is it showing you now?
I've just moved to a new city.
Mm-hmm.
We've certainly had a dramatic and difficult practice during the COVID years. They were very hard years, and both for people, but also for people in my profession, because we dealt with a great deal of sorrow and loss. We have come out of that, opening a new page in our life in terms of both our creative expressions, our professional expressions, and the way we're participating in the community.
And how old are you now, Bud?
86.
And life is still showing you new things.
Oh, yes. It was Dr. Jung's standpoint that we should face aging as if we're going to live for 400 years.
That's an interesting idea. Why have we got to imagine we're going to live for 400 years?
Because we want to look forward to the next day, and we want to look forward to creative activities, and we want to look forward to our own spiritual and emotional and mental growth.
I'm going to give you a quote of Jung. You will know it because I've stolen it from your book, so don't worry.
Okay.
Among all of my patients in the second half of life, there has not been one whose problems in the last resort was not finding a religious outlook on life.
That's right.
Tell us about that quote.
That quote means to me that we need to learn how to take life very seriously, but we also need to find depth and joy in it. And we need to focus on aspects of life that develop us spiritually as well as in other ways. So that we need to learn how to serve something larger than ourselves, both within ourselves and outside of ourselves. Now, that doesn't mean we need to take on a dramatic new profession or career, but it means that we have to have a different attitude toward what we're doing.
So we have to serve something greater than ourselves, both inside ourselves and outside ourselves.
Yes.
Can you give us an example of how that might manifest in a sort of day-to-day kind of basis?
I grew up in Atlanta, so I grew up in the era of Martin Luther King. And in his last crusade, where he got assassinated, he was telling the garbage men in Nashville, Tennessee, that they needed to honor themselves because they were doing a service for the whole community that made it better. And to look at what we're doing in a way that's making life better is a way on the outside that we need to do that. And I think that's very important because otherwise you look at that as just a crummy job. But you can look at a lot of jobs that way, or we can look at a lot of jobs as things that are making a contribution. We also need to look internally in ourselves. We need to develop our hearts, our spirits, and our minds so that we're serving the best spirit that lives within us.
So we're going to look at an example from one of our listeners about facing a threshold problem in their life. And let's look and see how sacred selfishness might be able to help them.
The Meaningful Life with Andrew G. Marshall. Please follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, and visit our website, andrewgmarshall.com/podcast, where you can join our supporters club and unlock bonus material and other benefits.
If you'd like to participate in the program, you can go to my website, www.andrewgmarshall.com/podcasts, where you'll find details of how to participate in the program. You can also sign up for my newsletter as well. Lots of interesting articles there. And if you go down, there's a place called Participate in the Program, and you can send a letter in to me. And this is one that I thought Bud might be able to help us with. I'm coming up to retirement age and wondering how to think about the next phase of life. I'm in the fortunate position that I work for myself, so I can continue for as long or as short a time as I wish. I have no financial worries, my health is okay, but I'm beginning to get aches and pains, and my doctor is concerned about my blood pressure. However, my parents both lived into their 80s, so I can carry on as before, working long hours, packed with meetings, taking on tantalizing new projects, or can I? I'm thinking about slowing down, taking some longer holidays and enjoying myself. But I worry about sloth and procrastination, which often seems to be knocking on my door. I'll get up on Sunday morning with a whole list of things I would like to do and find myself watching videos on YouTube and scrolling through Instagram. Before I know it, the day has half disappeared and I'm left with a feeling of mild depression. What have I achieved? Or is that a young man's question? And what should a man in his early 60s ask himself?
Very interesting letter, and I think a very important one for this time. You picked out a good one because we're facing a new era in history that people are now living 20 or 30 years longer than they did in the past. My grandfather didn't reach my age for sure, and neither did my father. So there are no patterns, there are no models for us to follow. But I think there are a couple of things that are very important. And my father was an American football coach, and American football has 4 quarters. And he was a very successful coach. And one of the things that he said that made him successful was that he took the philosophy that in the fourth quarter is when you play your strongest game. And that's when I'm looking at in my life. That's when I want to play my strongest game. Now, that doesn't mean that I want to achieve more than I achieved when I was when I was younger. And this gentleman is talking about a similar thing. The right question is not what I have achieved when we're in this age. It's more along the lines of what am I serving? What am I serving in life? What am I serving in myself? What am I serving creatively? And I believe in work. I like to work. I think work keeps us alive. It keeps us interested. It keeps us challenged. But we need not to be driven in it in the fourth quarter. It needs to be something that has more to do with we love what we're doing, more to do with passion than drivenness. And I think a lot of us, when we face this point that we have to change gears, we have to look at our life, we have to review our life, and we have to ask ourselves, what has been motivating? What have our goals been? Am I driven? If I'm driven, what does that mean? And in my own case, I thought my drivenness was a benefit. It helped me accomplish a lot of good things, but it was also something that I need to evolve out of because we can't face the fourth quarter of life that way without breaking down physically. And in the fourth quarter, we need to pay attention to body, mind, and spirit all in a holistic way. I need to respect my body. I need to respect my aging. I need to respect how my energy is changing and work in harmony with that, not work against that. So I didn't let myself carry drivenness over, even though I didn't get out of it all that easily. It took me a couple of years. If I'm thinking about sloth and procrastination, I would be thinking about, how was I indoctrinated? This sounds like I was indoctrinated a little bit, for lack of a better word, into the Protestant ethic. And that would make me be concerned that I was paying more attention to busyness than I was to actually what I was accomplishing. I would listen to my depression. And if on days when I want to do what he is doing, just watch YouTube or watch movies, I ask myself, do I really just need to take a time out here? Which sometimes I do. We have to take time outs if we're going to replenish ourselves, if we're going to grow creatively. And is my body telling me that when I'm too stubborn to see it? So we have to learn from ourselves, and we have to question ourselves and question these kind of things and realize that if we do, they can point us toward opportunities and they can point us toward relaxing in life a little bit more.
So when you get a desire to watch YouTube videos and scroll through Instagram, actually go a little bit deeper and ask yourself, what is it that I really want to do? How do I really want to replenish myself?
That, and also ask myself the question, do I need to chill out like this so that my creativity can replenish itself? Because my creativity needs time, that it's not being overrun by ego busyness.
And often scrolling through Instagram isn't going to feed you very much. It's not going to feed your creativity. It's just lots of flashy, nice images. How do you replenish yourself?
I don't scroll through Instagram because that stuff is too stimulating. So I prefer to either read, I like to listen to opera, I like to sit in the yard and watch the birds and the squirrels.
So we're beginning to come to the end of our interview. So as a witness on the meaningful life, and having had a long and meaningful life, what makes your life meaningful?
Things that I've already mentioned make it meaningful. To be fully engaged, I think, is the key to a meaningful life. That means to be willing to be open to the blood, sweat, tears, and laughter, but also to the sorrow and the grief, as well as the joy that all make up life, that make up us being human. And to be fully human is one of the main goals of individuation. I think it's one of the main spiritual goals in most of the great religions as well. So to be fully engaged. But there's a second step that I think is very important, and that is to reflect. You have a period of reflecting, to reflect on what my engagement brings to me, how it affects me emotionally, how it affects me internally, how it affects my life, and to seek to be aware of that and to understand that and to have it help me evolve into the new ways that my inner life is trying to evolve. And I think the other thing that has become very important to me in the fourth quarter is to cultivate a loving heart and to not get caught up in the wars in the world, but to cultivate a loving heart. And I don't mean sentimentality there.
So how do you not get caught up in the drama and the world then?
It's very difficult not to, because I feel like I need to participate and I need to contribute. But at the same time, I need to keep a certain distance that I don't get triggered by other people being triggered.
And how do you do that?
Carefully.
So this isn't where the conversation ends if you're a supporter of the meaningful life. We're going to be talking about the transforming power of suffering, because as we've said, you have to have the blood and the sweat and the tears along with the laughter and the joy. So, how do you embrace that transforming power of suffering? If you want to hear the bonus material, you can subscribe directly via Apple or Spotify. And if you want to become a supporter of the Meaningful Life, here are the details.
You've been listening to The Meaningful Life with Andrew G. Marshall. You can follow Andrew on Twitter, like him on Facebook, and please leave a review wherever you consume your podcasts. Making, editing, and distributing The Meaningful Life comes with substantial costs, and we'd like to ask for your help. Visit our website, andrewgmarshall.com/podcast, where you can join our supporters club and unlock bonus material for every program, send in a letter to be discussed by Andrew and his guests, and join a community of other people seeking to make their life meaningful. At the gold level, you get even more benefits. Production of The Meaningful Life with Andrew G. Marshall is by Michael Dooney. Social media by Madeleine Healy. Sound engineering and theme tune by Sebastian de la Luz Mendoza. And I'm Susie Colick. Please tell your friends and spread the word. Thank you.